Stop feeling like a fraud. Zen wisdom for inner peace, sleep. Right now, a restless, trembling vibration is humming steadily along the absolute bottom edges of both feet and through the flat pads of your toes. It feels like a faint, persistent shudder in your very foundation. A physical sensation of balancing on a narrow, crumbling ledge where a single misstep will reveal you to the world. This is the distinct somatic imprint of professional imposter syndrome, the chronic, exhausting dread that despite your years of continuous execution, your achievements are merely a series of lucky accidents, and you are destined to be exposed as an absolute fraud. Your mind is operating at a high, defensive velocity even in the dark, meticulously replaying your daytime contributions, anticipating criticism, and analyzing your performance as if you must construct a flawless defense before you can safely rest. You are carrying the weight of a solitary performer whose survival depends on never showing a single structural flaw. The quiet shelter of your room is adjusting to the damp autumn evening, providing a cool, unmonitored space where the constant demand to prove your competence can finally drop its momentum. Outside, the steady rhythmic roar of the mountain river rushes through the deep canyon below, while a low mist settles heavily into the valley, wrapping the tall timber framing of the village in a slow, silent moisture that requires no deliberate alignment. Inside, the clean, rustic scent of damp ash timber rises softly from the floorboards, blending naturally with the cold, minerals and earth aroma of wet granite blocks stacked neatly by the hearth. The dim amber glow of a single grease lamp burning in a shallow slate bowl casts long, motionless shadows across the rough-cut cedar walls, while the thick, tightly woven hemp mat beneath your frame absorbs the residual tension of your lower limbs. The unrefined, cool texture of the linen sheets beneath your ankles begins to draw the defensive heat away from your soles, gently inviting your toes to uncurl. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the heavy framework of your legs sink completely into the bedding, allowing the complex evaluations of your professional role to remain suspended in the mist outside. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are tracking in this restless, trembling vibration along the flat pads of your toes is not a personal failure, nor is it proof that you are an accidental fraud who has managed to deceive everyone around you. The profound exhaustion you carry tonight is a wise, somatic message, a clear physical signal that your system has simply grown weary of treating your daily work as a solitary, fragile performance that must be defended through endless vigilance. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately locate absolute confidence before your body is permitted to rest. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to fix your professional standing before your ankles are allowed to let go of their brace. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a liberating, beautiful paradox within the heart of Buddhist insight that addresses this specific panic of exposure through a surprising truth. We live under the persistent illusion that our safety is achieved by carving out an isolated, permanently unshakable identity, a solitary self that can take absolute credit for every success or absolute blame for every mistake. We treat our career as a fragile footbridge that we must support entirely on our own shoulders, fearing that if we show a single weakness, the entire structure will collapse into the gorge. But the ancient wisdom of the Zen tradition reveals that true stability is found not by perfecting a solitary performance, but by recognizing that you have never been separate from the massive foundation beneath you. This is the mystery of the unpinned mortise peg, a single ashwood dowel rattling faintly within a walkway joint. Does not mean the immense granite plinths holding the bridge are about to slide into the river silt. The suffering does not come from the small rattling of your self-doubt. It grows from the habit of treating that loose peg as if it were the entire foundation of your life. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, visceral dropping in your chest when an unexpected piece of professional feedback or an ambiguous message makes you feel as though your entire career is standing on a loose platform. The intellect instantly turns inward, converting this natural performance anxiety into a harsh moral verdict, whispering that because you feel insecure, you are a fundamental failure who has merely been lucky so far. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the simple fatigue of a demanding path. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral reality of navigating a complex role with limited data, the natural limitation of a human mind trying to build a bridge across a wide gorge. The second pain, however, is the one you strike against your own souls, declaring that your uncertainty is a permanent defect that must be corrected through even harder mental scrutiny tomorrow. But the river silt does not apologize to the canyon for its depth, and the heavy ash logs do not feel remorse for their natural knots. The vibration you hold is merely a temporary configuration of form, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is cradling your room tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a cold, misty river canyon beneath a half-finished timber footbridge, where a young joiner sat staring at a hand-carved ashwood dowel with a split head, carrying the exact same trembling energy that is binding your lower limbs right now. But before we step onto those damp cedar planks, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your lower body. Let the fine muscles around your calves and your Achilles tendons drop their defensive bracing. Let your heels feel heavy and thick, and let the flat pads of your toes give up their tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel perfectly stable before the morning light arrives. The world will manage its own complex structures without your constant supervision for the next few hours, and every unpinned peg, every unfinished review, and every rattling joint can remain completely stranded in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our professional standing as a solitary monument that must be continuously fortified against exposure, believing that if we let our protection drop for even a single hour, we will be completely ruined by failure. We evaluate our stability by the tightness of our grip, and then we wonder why our lower legs feel like cold iron when the daylight fades. But the vast mountain gorge does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining exposed, rugged and unfinished beneath the autumn stars, and the damp moss does not apologize to the granite for growing in the cracks. The nervousness you hold does not come from the simple fact that you have a difficult job to perform. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the bridge rattle, without demanding that your core immediately justify its presence through more overthinking. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its velocity or prove its alignment. Let it move directly into the tight channels of your lower back, down through the back of your thighs, and deep into the very center of your soles. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, expectations, and protective enclosures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool canyon air is moving through the wet wood outside, requiring no final justifications and demanding no perfect confidence before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen beneath your feet as we prepare to step onto the damp timber walkway, where the keeper of the bridges is waiting to show us how to let the foundation hold us. Deep within the damp, emerald-shadowed chasm, where the mountain river carved its thunderous path through the ancient slate, the air hung heavy with the clean, cold scent of wet granite and river silt. In this hidden canyon, beneath the massive, mist-slicked timbers of a half-finished footbridge spanning the white water, a young joiner named Kenji worked with a restless, continuous trembling that stayed concentrated entirely in the soles of his feet. His days were consumed by a quiet but agonizing internal warfare. Having been appointed as the secondary craftsman for this crucial mountain passage, he spent his evenings crouched by an oil wick, repeatedly checking his joinery diagrams and remeasuring his timber cuts, utterly convinced that his inclusion among the master builders was a terrible mistake. He lived in constant terror of a sudden inspection, replaying every minor adjustment he had made during the day, believing that his skill was an accidental pretense, and that the very next footprint on the walkway would reveal his incompetence to the entire province. Every night, long after the heavy broadaxes had been laid to rest in the tool chests, Kenji's lower limbs retained the rigid, defensive leverage of a person balancing on a crumbling cliff. He treated his structural contributions not as a collective effort supported by the earth, but as a fragile, solitary performance that he had to defend through unceasing vigilance. He filled his awareness with complex calculations of failure, interpreting the natural groaning of the green logs as an immediate proof of his hidden deficiency. Yet, the more frantically, he sought to secure a perfect, flawless alignment through mental repetition, the more disconnected and ungrounded his foundation felt, leaving the flat pads of his toes locked in a perpetual curl that refused to let his weight settle into the floor. The master carpenter of the gorge bridge was Jisho, an elder whose forearms were ropey and scarred from decades of hewing rough timber, and whose slow, deliberate stride held the absolute, unshakable mass of the river cliffs. Jisho did not offer abstract architectural lectures or deliver formal praise to the apprentices who squared the logs, choosing instead to spend his twilights walking the lower scaffolding or inspecting the framing joints with his bare palms. He had been quietly tracking the progressive freezing of Kenji's posture, noting how the young man always stood on the very tips of his toes when the master approached, and how his breathing remained shallow, rapid, and braced, as if he were constantly waiting for the structure to drop beneath his frame. On a twilight when the autumn mist began to pack the canyon walls in a thick gray insulation, leaving the roaring water below sounding muffled and distant, Jisho called the young joiner to the lower staging platform. The workspace was intensely quiet, save for the slow drip of moisture from the cedar beams and the cold draft rising from the river stones. On the dark oak bench between them lay a hand-carved ashwood dowel, with a split head and ordinary, unpolished mortise peg that had been shaved slightly too thin during the afternoon framing, causing it to sit loosely within its bracket. Kenji stood near the bench, the soles of his feet vibrating with an intense, familiar panic, his intellect instantly spinning an elaborate explanation to justify why the pin had slipped, preparing a defensive brief before the old master could accuse him of ruining the bridge. The elder builder did not lift his iron mallet, and he did not voice a single word of reprimand regarding the day's progress. Instead, Jisho reached out, rolled the loose ashwood dowel across the grain so it touched the young man's trembling fingers, and asked Kenji to consider if the footbridge was held aloft by the absolute perfection of that single unpinned peg, or if the massive granite plinths rooted 50 feet deep into the riverbed were already sustaining the canyon long before the timber was ever brought to the site. Kenji looked down at the small piece of wood, the cold, wet grain of the ash cooling the frantic heat of his palm, his breath catching deep in his throat with a sudden, visceral wave of emotional recognition. The dowel had not caused the bridge to lean, rather, because it was designed to sit within a dynamic interlocking system of shifting logs and changing moisture. Its slight looseness was merely a natural pocket of space within a vast collective architecture. He looked up at the master carpenter, the flat pads of his toes slowly beginning to uncurl against the wet planks, as the image of the rattling pin mirrored the exact condition of his own professional isolation. He realized that his mind had been treating his own self-doubt like that single, loose peg, believing that his internal uncertainty was a fatal flaw that would cause his entire life to collapse into the silt, when in truth, his frantic calculations were only blinding him to the massive, immovable foundation that had been holding his work all along. The old master took the split dowel back, slid it into his tool pouch without any urgency to replace it tonight, and looked out over the roaring river rapids. He told the apprentice that the torment of the builder is not the limitation of his chisel, but the delusion that his solitary ego must carry the entire weight of the gorge. Jisho pointed out that the bridge stayed true because it rested on the shared mass of the timber walls, the stone brackets, and the deep granite plinths, not because an isolated joiner performed without a tremor. The trembling Kenji felt in his lower limbs did not exist because he was an accidental fraud. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of separating himself from the very foundation that was actively sustaining his weight. Kenji sat down on the raw edge of the staging platform, letting his bare heels drop over the side, the cool, moist canyon air moving through his lower legs as his ankles finally surrendered their defensive brace. For the first time in many seasons, the restless, buzzing vibration along the bottom edges of his feet began to lose its sharp momentum, allowing his weight to drop completely into the massive cedar logs beneath him. He did not instantly become a flawless master craftsman in that single hour, and his self-doubt did not magically vanish from his thoughts. But he made one vital choice. He stopped treating the rattling of the pin as a command to panic, allowing himself to sit quietly with the unfinished architecture of the day. Slowly, the deep, unhurried stability of that misty river canyon moves into the immediate shelter of your own room tonight, letting the image of the resting timber anchor your over-fortified mind. You have been lying awake, replaying the metrics of your competence, counting the loose pegs in your performance, and letting the fear of exposure convince you that you are standing on a platform of sand. You have believed that if you do not maintain a flawless, solitary defense, your entire career will drop into the dark. But the massive, interconnected floor of your true nature remains completely undisturbed by the small rattling of your thoughts. Let the dowel rest in the pouch, allowing your awareness to slide downward into the heavy, immovable reality of the ground beneath your frame. This reflection on the hand-carved ashwood dowel and the misty lower staging platform is not telling us to numb our natural care for our livelihood, nor is it asking us to become cold, detached machines who do not feel a genuine desire to perform our roles with skill and integrity. It is not an instruction to erase the real, visceral vulnerability that surfaces when we step into an environment where our contributions are evaluated, or where a slight unexpected variation in our performance makes the soles of our feet vibrate with sudden insecurity. Instead, it is revealing something much quieter, a soft shift in our internal perspective that allows us to navigate our professional commitments without transforming our lower limbs into a constant emergency brace. The persistent, restless trembling that vibrates through the flat pads of your toes tonight does not manifest simply because your responsibilities are significant or your environment is demanding. The deepest suffering takes root when the intellect insists on treating every small, rattling pocket of self-doubt as an absolute confirmation that your entire life is an accidental fraud about to fall into the river silt. When we look at this pattern of professional performance anxiety through the simple, immediate language of Buddhist insight, we see that what we traditionally call attachment is actually that frantic, defensive clenching that insists, until I can guarantee that every single cut of my chisel is flawless and universally praised, my foundation is forbidden to drop its weight. It is the exhausting habit of using total hypervigilance as a false metric of stability, desperately trying to preempt every potential criticism just to prevent the terrifying sensation of exposure. We treat our professional worth as an isolated timber footbridge that we must carry entirely on our own narrow shoulders. And when a single joint rattles, we experience the desperate emotional state of craving the endless Latinite mental loop that tries to force the unpinned peg into alignment through sheer force of overthinking. We mistake our temporary, changing thoughts for the permanent substance of our reality, forgetting that a loose dowel sitting in a bracket cannot diminish the massive granite blocks anchored 50 feet deep into the bed. An ashwood pin left sitting loosely on the dark oak bench cannot collapse the passage across the chasm. No matter how many winters you spend replaying your edits in the dark, the day's construction has already ground to a halt. The broadaxes have been locked away. The canyon has settled into its thick insulation of mist. When we lie awake burning our remaining internal energy to maintain these frantic, protective calculations, we are participating in a quiet psychological process that adds an entirely unnecessary second wound to the first. The first wound is merely the raw, neutral reality of a complex human life, the natural limitation of managing an unmapped path with incomplete data, navigating an ambiguous review, or feeling the simple fatigue of a demanding assignment. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily work. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own souls when our thoughts turn inward and declare, because your joint is rattling and your confidence has slipped, you are an absolute failure who has merely been lucky so far. Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the trembling vibration humming along the bottom edges of your feet right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for a solitary, unshakable performance with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of attention is not a complicated academic discipline that you must study before your lower legs are permitted to soften. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the parched landscape of your professional worries, without allowing that dryness to dictate the depth of your immediate breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid restriction behind your ankles, to label it gently as the old habit of treating your life as an isolated footbridge, and to recognize that the rattling belongs entirely to the loose pin, not to the wide, interconnected floor that is holding you tonight. When you allow the dowel to rest in the tool pouch without continuously testing it against your value, you stop feeding the analytical frost that keeps your toes curled. You let the day exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked spirit. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental weight of your professional standing is not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your skin. That grand collection of rules and evaluations was a temporary configuration of thoughts that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this bed is entirely separate from those analytical calculations, its calves capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of an absolute standard. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive freeze just to protect an intellectual platform that has already returned to the silence of the gorge. True letting go does not mean you stop caring about your craft, or that you pretend your self-doubt does not feel heavy. It means you stop using the tightness of your armor as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the trembling, thinned channels of your past effort to hide. Look at the loose wood with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the structure to rattle where it wills, without demanding that your foundation become perfectly flawless before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your life must always hold an intact display of absolute protection for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own unfinished architecture and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external validation. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the complex safety codes you tried to maintain during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the layout of your career standings before it agrees to warm your feet, and your lungs do not demand a perfect guarantee of approval from the masters before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual performance, resting securely within a night that requires no completed insights before it offers you its rest. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen beneath your ankles as we prepare to step onto the dry stonecutter's hut, where the old nun is waiting to show us the nature of the weight that remains when the solitary ego is finally set aside. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right along the broad, flat soles of both feet, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that restless, trembling vibration has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of your professional evaluations away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn, unyielding shudder behind your ankles, as if you were merely looking at a hand-carved ashwood dowel resting on a dark oak bench, without any urgency to hammer the pin or force the footbridge to instantly carry a massive legion of travelers. As you rest here in the deep, indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your calves, your Achilles tendons, and the lowest chambers of your lungs. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your lower limbs drop their protective brace, allowing the ankles to loosen slightly open naturally. And let your heels feel heavy, as if they were dissolving into the damp, cedar-lined staging platform beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment. And even just noticing that your foundation muscles still feel tight, guarded, or full of dry friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been applying its frantic vigilance against the vast uncertainty of an unfortified space. Right now, let the specific memory of that professional interaction float up into your awareness, perhaps the exact moment where you feared sudden exposure, the exhaustion of watching your performance rules multiply without a guarantee, or the general, heavy worry that you will be revealed as an accidental fraud if anyone sees a single structural flaw in your joint. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past caution, and do not try to fix the professional record of the day that has gone. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your toes. You might say to yourself, very quietly, this is the habit of checking the mortise, or this is the old analytical frost trying to tighten the unpinned peg. Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal laboratory and standing beside Master Jisho on the damp cedar planks, looking at the loose wood from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your remaining worries about competence are like that loose ashwood dowel, its natural capacity having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous, dry hypervigilance. Look at its split head in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough grain today, fixing your sight entirely upon the tiny vibration, letting that minor rattle convince you that your entire career is about to fall into the river silt. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure a conceptual certainty, that persistent wish to hide your natural vulnerability beneath a mountain of approval, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the hollow, dark vault of the container. You do not have to build a fortress across the chasm with your exhaustion, and you do not have to decipher the infinite mystery. You are simply setting the implement down on the slate counter, while you step back into your choosing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your lower neck as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the split, dry wood begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the autumn evening. Imagine the thick, sun-baked crust of oxidation beginning to soften naturally, its dark layers expanding, splitting and flaking away from the underlying timber under the gentle pressure of the damp air, leaving the unlined stone curb of your awareness completely clear and open beneath the surface. The faint, comforting aroma of river silt rises from the lower scaffolding, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced execution of logic. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the table does not diminish the capacity of the stone to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured field that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the market agreements, the expectations of the village elders, or the structures you wish you could fortify to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its protective spaces. The slow hiss of the grease lamp outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the unpinned mortise peg. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its frost through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the bridge builder rest on the table, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner canyon wide, unanchored, and deeply at peace. Further downstream, where the canyon walls narrowed into an absolute throat of wet granite, and the roaring mountain rapids created a continuous, mist-filled hum that vibrated through the very floorboards of the shore, a solitary stonecutter's hut sat bolted to the dark ledge, Inside this small cedar-shingled workspace, the air stayed thick with the cold, mineral scent of crushed slate, wet river silt, and the damp ash firewood smoldering in a stone pit. Here lived Toru, an advanced mason who had spent a decade shaping the massive underwater foundation blocks for the mountain trail bridges. Despite his proven capability to carve stone that withstood the violent seasonal floods, Toru carried a relentless, buzzing vibration along the absolute bottom edges of both feet, an internal echo of an unyielding anxiety that he was a complete impostor. Every time a new bridge plinth was lowered into the white water, his chest would lock, and the flat pads of his toes would curl in a desperate, defensive grip, paralyzed by the conviction that his calculations were an accidental pretense, and that the river would eventually expose a hidden flaw, revealing his incompetence to the elders. This persistent dread had intensified to a state of sharp emotional crisis during the recent autumn floods. As the rushing waters carved away a bank of ancient clay, they exposed a deep, natural fissure running through the side of a massive granite footing Toru had laid 3 winters before. Although the bridge above remained perfectly level, supported by the immense, collective weight of the interlocking timbers and the canyon bedrock, Toru's intellect transformed the exposed crack into an absolute verdict on his entire life. He spent his nights in the isolated hut, frantically replaying his past measurements under the dim light of a tallow wick, preparing elaborate internal justifications, and mapping out endless structural repairs. He operated under the stubborn, exhausting assumption that every self-critical thought crossing his awareness was a literal truth, believing that his pervasive sense of fraudulence was an accurate blueprint of his imminent ruin. While the trembling in his soles grew so intense, it felt as though the very planks beneath him were dissolving into sand. The keeper of the lower foundation works was Sister Sayo, an old nun whose forearms were stained with gray stone dust and whose quiet, unhurried stride held the absolute neutral mass of the river cliffs. Sayo did not offer abstract psychological definitions or engage in formal debates with the artisans, choosing instead to spend her hours splitting slate tiles or dressing the rough margins of the foundation blocks with an unpolished iron mallet. She had been quietly tracking the progressive freezing of Toru's movements, noting how his ankles remained rigid even when he was sitting by the hearth, and how he repeatedly checked the set of his level, as if he were trying to force the entire canyon to prove his personal safety. On an evening when the cold river mist began to leak through the cracks in the cedar door, wrapping the interior of the hut in a damp gray stillness, Sayo called the anxious mason to her workbench. Between them lay a large block of unyielding gray granite, its face rough and untamed from the quarry. In her hand, Sayo held an unpolished iron mallet with a loose willow handle, an ordinary, well-worn tool whose wooden shaft had shrunk slightly from the seasonal dampness, causing the heavy iron head to wobble faintly whenever it was lifted. Toru stood near the bench, the bottom edges of his feet humming with an intense, familiar panic, his mind instantly leaping to the conclusion that the wobbly tool was a dangerous error, an unacceptable vulnerability that would cause the blow to strike off center and ruin the stone. Before he could offer an intricate explanation on how to wedge the wood or replace the handle to ensure absolute precision, the old woman raised the wobbly mallet and struck the granite block with a slow, rhythmic blow. The heavy iron head rattled against the willow shaft with a low, clicking vibration, yet the impact left a perfectly clean, straight fracture along the grain of the stone. Toru watched the rock split, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, profound wave of emotional recognition. He reached out his hand, his fingers touching the rough iron of the wobbly tool, realizing that the mallet did not need to be a completely rigid, unyielding monolith to perform its function in the canyon. The loose handle was not a fatal defect, it was simply a temporary condition of the wood, entirely incapable of breaking the heavy, collective momentum of Sayo's arm and the massive granite floor supporting her stance. In that quiet moment, Toru experienced a subtle, grounding transformation, not an instant entry into flawless mastery, but a small, vital shift in how he related to his own internal suffering. He stopped the frantic habit of treating his anxious thoughts as absolute reality. He looked down at his own trembling feet, then at the loose willow handle, and realized that his feelings of fraudulence were nothing more than that faint wobble in the mallet, a passing vibration in a dynamic, imperfect tool, completely separate from the deep, immovable foundation that was actively sustaining his life. For the first time in many winters, he stopped resisting the reality of the cracked plinth down in the river silt. He accepted that he could not control the natural fissures of the stone or the unpredictable currents of the white water. But he could choose to stop using his own intellect to hammer a second wound into his soul. With a soft, deliberate release of tension, Toru took a long, slow breath before his mind could construct another strategy of defense. And instead of trying to fix the wobbly mallet or flee the repository in shame, he chose one small act of compassionate discipline. He walked out onto the slick, mist-covered staging platform, where a young apprentice was struggling to secure a heavy guide rope against the rushing current. Though his own lower limbs still hummed with a residual nervousness, and his hands were cold from the alpine draft, Toru did not allow the thought of his insufficiency to paralyze his frame. He knelt on the damp cedar planks beside the boy, wrapped his fingers around the rough hemp cord, and added his weight to the collective effort, letting his soles rest flat against the timber without needing to verify his perfection to the canyon tonight. This was the quiet realization that brought a different relationship with his difficulty, the understanding that the self remains safe and whole, even when the mind holds a pocket of deep uncertainty, resting securely within an interconnected world that requires no flawless performance to remain complete. He returned to the stonecutter's hut as the midnight darkness sealed the gorge, letting the wobbly iron mallet rest quietly on the bench of dry seed husks. He did not become a magically perfect mason whose self-doubt never returned. But as he prepared to lay his frame down upon the thick hemp mat, he stopped treating the rattling of his thoughts as an absolute command to panic. The river continued its thunderous roar beneath the footbridge. The exposed fissure remained down in the cold silt, and the future was entirely unwritten. But his lower legs finally dropped their defensive leverage, allowing his awareness to slide downward into the massive, undisturbed reality of the ground beneath his bed. When we turn our awareness downward into the restless, buzzing vibration currently anchoring itself along the absolute bottom edges of both feet, we begin to decode the hidden structural mechanism that converts ordinary professional vulnerability into a permanent state of internal exile. We frequently live under the stubborn illusion that this constant fear of sudden exposure, this deep, visceral dread of being revealed as an accidental fraud, is an external verdict imposed by a critical environment or a highly demanding career path. But if you observe the tight, unyielding brace holding your ankle joints still tonight, you will see that this defensive platform is an active, ongoing construction of your own intellect. It is the somatic consequence of using absolute containment as a shield against the fluid, changing movements of reality. We treat our minds as a constant joinery bench, frantically checking the mortise and hammering the pins under the tragic delusion that if we can maintain an unblemished boundary of performance, we will finally be safe from the risk of being found wanting. This habitual reliance on hypervigilant calculation is a deeply rooted form of resistance against the natural uncertainty of existence. When an unexpected professional shift occurs, perhaps an ambiguous piece of feedback from a master, a sudden change in a collaborative alignment, or the quiet dread of navigating a role without a precise blueprint, the mind experiences a profound sense of threat. Instead of allowing the raw, cold texture of that vulnerability to pass through the lower limbs, the intellect immediately steps forward to take command, working at an immense, frantic velocity to categorize and calculate the space. We rehearse the future, we replay the past, and we construct endless defensive arguments in our thoughts, operating under the assumption that keeping our life perfectly measured is the only true way to prevent a sudden fall. But this constant scanning acts exactly like the wobbly iron mallet driven repeatedly against the willow shaft. It internalizes the rattle, turning a natural piece of timber into an unstable sliver that warps under the simple weight of the air, leaving the soles locked in a rigid curl, while the living clarity of your original nature turns stagnant beneath the surface. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological structures the mind builds on top of it. Simple Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma by making a direct, compassionate distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is merely the raw, neutral impact of being a sensitive creature in a world constructed out of changing forms, temporary alignments, and natural human boundaries. It is the sudden arrival of an unexpected fissure in a foundation block. It is the raw sensation of realizing you must perform a role before your training feels complete. It is the simple, unavoidable sorrow that occurs when a professional path or relationship runs out of generative space. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of a dynamic life. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain. For the freezing river mist in the deep chasm does not ask the permission of the stonecutter before it passes through the cedar shingles of the hut. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our soles and toe joints, where we translate a temporary pocket of professional insecurity into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling tired or uncertain. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because your joint is rattling and your confidence has slipped. You are a fundamental failure who has merely been lucky so far." We do not just navigate an intense period of professional transition, our thoughts declare. This unmapped path is proof that your core is inherently broken and incapable of finding a balance. This is the mechanism of turning a temporary pocket of stagnation into a solid identity, the unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural piece of willow timber for an eternal monument that must be forced into shape through even harder mental scrutiny. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-criticism as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal investigator we carry in our skin. We believe that keeping the inner dialogue sharp, analytical, and critical is a form of protection that, if we keep the file moving against the wood, we will somehow force ourselves to remain safely unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for conceptual approval, trying to decipher the hidden motives of friends and colleagues to prevent the sudden sting of conflict. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental categories is like trying to preserve a balance scale. By cutting the notches deeper into the beam, the markings remain trapped in a blurry line, waiting to restrict your natural breathing. The moment the amber light fades, true inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single relationship of your life to become perfectly predictable through an act of sheer will. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand by the cedar counter without immediately picking up the iron mallet to strike your own foundation. When you allow the reality of the unmeasured hour to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the crushed slate in the dark, letting the plain timber beam remain unnotched in your lap, and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of perfect clarity running through your foundation. As you let the bed support the heavy framework of your spine right now, notice how the desperate urge to possess a perfect explanation begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire professional standing or personal history before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your path will be fully balanced by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect machine that never experiences the sting of doubt or isolation. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the heavy vibration along your soles, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, silent chasm that holds both the raw timber and the quiet grease lamp. You are not the wobbly handle that is currently resting in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your lower frame. Let your toe joints and your ankle muscles expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of conceptual performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unmapped, smooth, and supportive as the unnotched wood before the first line of calculation was ever forced into its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain repository and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The unpinned mortise peg and the wobbly iron mallet we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old wilderness archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your ankle joints and your deep foot muscles when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or an analytical answer that might validate your choices or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the metric of human alignment. We live so much of our modern lives inside this structural hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external confirmation of our safety, replaying a minor professional mistake or an unclassified interaction as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable guide during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unadorned self is simply not enough to sustain our place in the valley. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for reassurance, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single, slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping the heavy timber bridge so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone frame. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless execution, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner schedule remains unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the logs or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the seasoned cedar does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an unladen chassis, and the raw granite stones do not apologize to the ridge for letting their basin remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to push an overweighted cart through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unuttered arguments, the missed markers, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own pelvic bowl. When we attempt to control the past or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Toru before his fingers were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the warping joist exist as a natural configuration of a vast, shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw timber, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your lower spine, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The goal you missed or the checklist you could not deliver is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy. And you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the counter without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your wrists relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhandled rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving mist that holds the deep river canyon in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless measurement you tried to build beneath the soles of your feet, and every anxious reach for professional validation has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant village elders are no longer pulling at your ankle joints. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp canyon silt, leaving your internal architecture completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your lower limbs and your deep heel bones are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the unpinned timber of your true nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the deep canyon bedrock. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your chest cage. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the mountain draft, passing directly through the cedar-shingled walls of the stonecutter's hut. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, restless vibration that you held across your soles is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your uncompleted joinery calculations are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal investigator. The unpolished iron mallets have been laid down on the oak workbench. The split ash dowels are resting in the tool pouch, and the critical analytical voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The wobbly wooden handles, the cracked foundation plinths, and the performance reviews for tomorrow do not require your active parsing while the high gorge is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window pane, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire professional history before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unmeasured, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no conceptual performance before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the massive, deep-rooted granite is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your feet with an enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure a solitary, flawless execution. The vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot fall, because it belongs to the raw, uncarved floor of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless tracking and imposter anxiety. Your lower frame is loose. Your ankles are heavy like a dark slab of slate resting in the frost, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the ultimate safety you have been building so fiercely to earn lives, not in the perfect rigidity of a solitary joint, but in the absolute stability of massive granite boulders resting undisturbed in a windless forest bed beneath a midnight sky? The massive granite blocks do not shift their weight when the seasonal floods rise, nor do they panic over the microscopic fractures winding through their ancient stone cores. They simply ground themselves in the deep canyon bed, a silent foundation of unmonitored endurance, allowing the churning white water to pass completely over them without trying to contain a single crest of the river's rush. All the residual, heavy static that accumulated along the flat pads of your toes during the long hours of monitoring your performance, hiding your self-doubt, and checking the structural alignments of your daily work is losing its frantic velocity, dissolving into the wide, cold simplicity of this midnight hour. The internal builder that keeps your ankles taut is running out of joists to measure, because there is no master left to please, no standard of absolute perfection to defend, and no dynamic law that requires your foundation to be flawless to stay secure. You are simply here, a physical form resting in the shadow, entirely separate from the public metrics, protective pretense, and performance anxiety you carried during the daylight hours. When we observe this restless vibration through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true inner safety is not a reward earned by successfully engineering a solitary, unshakable career. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with your own uncertainty, allowing the wobbly handle to rattle within its joint without transforming that natural looseness into an absolute verdict on your existence. The intellect creates the second wound when it takes the raw, neutral fatigue of professional exposure and wraps it in a narrative of systemic fraudulence, whispering that you must continuously stiffen your stance to protect your place from falling. But the deep mountain chasm does not count the grains of sand that settle on the scaffolding, and the heavy cedar planks do not check the village tallies before they agree to hold their space through the autumn mist. You are fully permitted to be unfinished. You are allowed to let the defensive mallet rest without believing that your core foundation has been ruined by a single rattling peg. Think of how much vital energy has been spent in the late night hours trying to construct a flawless defense against exposure, replaying the moments where your confidence wavered, or trying to guarantee that your professional standing will be perfectly unyielding when the sun rises. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping, that treats every minor mistake as a dangerous ledge about to crumble, is the very weight that leaves your heels feeling so thinned and rigid. But tonight, the high gorge is quiet, and the stonecutter's workbench is still. The metric you missed or the validation you could not secure is merely a temporary configuration in a long, complex journey of human growth, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your lower frame right now. You do not have to finish aligning the bridge to be worthy of this hour, and you do not need to feel completely unshakable before you let your ankles yield to the dark. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern obligations behind and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your body. Feel the quiet mass of your lower limbs as they give their entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of conceptual execution. The massive river plinths have held their level through countless changing tides, without needing to generate a single notch of progress to prove their utility. And your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every performance review, every delayed message, and every expectation of absolute competence can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your door, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint, rhythmic whisper of mountain water, passing deep beneath the heavy timber walkway when the storm has entirely spent its force. There is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the canyon and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your feet. The professional anxieties and safety calculations that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent vapor, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence. Without leaving a single fracture behind, you are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your internal harmony by the tightness of your grip. The silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final expectations and standards of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, smooth, and silent as the unnotched wood before the first line of calculation was ever forced into its surface. There are no positions to satisfy, no evaluation tallies to maintain, and no versions of your capacity to defend in this beautiful protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your active pull for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own sky when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your lower frame, but the simple willingness to let the alignment soften and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.